So relax. God's got a plan. Second question. A big piece of the story is this figure called Joseph, right? Remember Joseph? Everybody remembers Joseph? He was a man, Joseph, and he was given some visions and everything. But the question is this: why was Joseph sold as a slave into Egypt? He was what? Poor? No, he was actually very well taken care of when he lived with his father. But then you're right, he became a slave. So listen to the story. So Joseph lives with his daddy, right? We're talking about Joseph in the Old Testament. Yeah. So he lives with his daddy. He's one of the favorite sons. And then all of a sudden this incident happens and Joseph is sold into Egypt as a slave. But Joseph just saw the dreams. Joseph just had a perfect prophecy given to him that his future is bright and glorious, that he's going to be a major player in the fulfillment of God's will in his nation. And here he is sitting in that well or whatever it was, that hole in the ground his brothers threw him in, and then the caravan is passing by and they sell him and he's taken to Egypt. And I wonder what was going through his mind on that journey. But you know why Joseph was sold to Egypt as a slave? The simple answer: he wouldn't have gone otherwise. That's a simple answer. That's a logical answer. He wouldn't have gone otherwise. He was wearing a coat of many colors. He was all set. His daddy loved him. He was the most favorite child. And oh, by the way, he was the most favorite child with the most promising future. Because he had the dreams, he had the visions, he had stuff coming his way, or so he thought, that it's going to be amazing. He truly believed that. He wouldn't have gone otherwise. Let me give you a personal example. You know what it took for me to come to Georgia and my family? The simple answer is, it took a good kick in my rear end by God to uproot us in Massachusetts and to transition us into Georgia. That's a simple answer. That's a logical answer. Why? Because I wouldn't have gone otherwise. We were too comfortable. Everything else was great. And then all of a sudden, but God moment happened. Things turned ugly. Things turned bad. Things turned even uglier. And then from ugly and uglier, they turned very, very ugly. And then we had to make a decision and make a choice. Logically, we had every reason to quit. And then we had a but God moment. And you know what was the plan of God for Joseph? God's plan is Christ came as a low servant to rise to the highest of powers. And Joseph was an example of that. The salvation plan was unfolding, and Joseph was an example in playing a part of that. Why? Because the nation of Israel would usher in the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. So he went to Egypt as a slave, as a servant. And he rose up to the positions of power and influence. Why? Because God was with Joseph, the Bible says. He wouldn't have gone otherwise. He would have stayed home. Because at home everything was dandy and taken care of. Everything was glorious. Everything was powerful. So we need to relax because God has a plan. And very often that plan does not unfold in the way that we would have thought. Very often that does not happen in the way that we have imagined or pictured to ourselves. This is what I put down. It is the journey that counts. You see, it is the journey that counts. It's what happens to you and I when we are slaves. It's what happens to you and I when we are servants. It's what happens to you and I when we are in prison. It's what happens to you and I when we are under pressure and circumstances. It's what happens to you and I and how we act when nobody likes us. It's what happens to you and I and how we act when nobody agrees with us. It's what happens to you and I and how we act when we share the vision that we saw from God and we receive resistance and opposition and everything else. Are you with me so far? Relax, God's got a plan. But trust me, that journey it's going to be nothing like you have ever imagined. It might take you just a little lower than you expected. It might take just a little longer than you thought. But my friend, you're leaving with great possessions afterwards. You're coming out and taking positions of power and influence that you have never even dreamed of. But you know what? You're going to be a different man and a different woman by the time you get there. By the time you sit on the throne and everybody's looking and applauding, you're going to know who you become inside. And you're going to be humble and you're going to be mumbling under your breath. But God, but God. But God, but God, but God. Like David. He sat down after they came and anointed him as king. He sat down and he said, God. Everybody left. He found a quiet place. He said, God, who am I? Who's my Father's house? That you have done all these great things in my life. And there are people coming, they anointed me as king. They were just chasing me for years, wanting to kill me. But now they come and they applaud. They're like, yeah, come on, we want you to be king over us. Because we heard that there was a prophecy. We heard that Samuel has anointed you. Well, didn't Samuel anoint me back then? What took you so long? Relax. God's got a plan. Third question is, why were male children killed by the Egyptians? Why were the male children killed by the Egyptians? The simple answer is Egypt got a little too crowded. That's the simple answer, yeah. They wanted to get rid of them. It was just, they said it's just a little too many of them. We are afraid this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But let me give you an example. All of you know the story of World War II, right? Germany was in economic chaos, inflation, depression, economically. And then comes around this handy-dandy, smart, clever man with a vision for the nation that can restore it and rebuild it and turn it around and everything. And he gets elected to be the chancellor of Germany, rising up in the ranks and everything, and he's elected to be the leader of Germany. Yeah, his name is Hitler. Did you know he never took over by force? He was elected to be the leader. And he actually turned the nation around. He really did. But in the midst of all of the things that were happening, things were going great, things were going good, things were going amazing, economy was taking off and jobs and the nation was getting stronger and everything was being rebuilt. In the midst of all of that, there was an agenda that the man was pursuing. The agenda from the pits of hell. And that agenda was to destroy the Jewish people. Wipe them out. Kill them. Gas them. Burn them. Shoot them. Do whatever it takes, but to completely eliminate the nation of Israel. I mean, there was no nation. The people of Israel. He thought it was a little too crowded in his country. And then when he realized they were in other countries, he thought, well, we'll take over and clean up a mess. So, the example is, if it was not for brave people doing the right thing in the face of death, there would have been no people, Jewish people, left in those countries that Hitler was controlling. But people sacrificing their own lives, people endangering their own families and their own children, their own future. They took in Jewish people, they hid them, they protected, they did the right things, being brave. In the midst of death, breathing down their neck, going against the regime, going against the system, going against the the Germans were just brainwashed. There was this ideology, just similar to communism. So sort of everybody wanted this brighter, better future at a cost of other lives. So the brave people were moving against this ideology, and they were saving Jewish people and protecting Jewish people. But you know what the end result was, don't you? You know the end result after the World War II. History tells us that. The nation of Israel did not exist for 2,000 years. And then after all of this Holocaust and everything terrible that has happened, he gave a birth to the nation of Israel. And they reappeared on the world's map. In one day. Let me tell you this. There's a prophecy in the Old Testament that says, will a nation be born in one day? Relax, God's got a plan. It might come to pass just a little differently than you think, just a little differently than you saw or imagined, but God has promised that his plan will come to pass. So why were they killing male children? Was it just because it was a little crowded? Or was it because there was a plan from the pits of hell that the enemy knew the promise of God to Abraham, that is going to be 400 years. And as it started to approach that time, the enemy got worried and started killing the children of the boys, the male children. Why? Because God always works through a man. God always and only works through a man or a woman. Through a person. He doesn't work just by angels. He doesn't work just miracles. But he works through people to whom he entrusts the vision, to whom he explains his will, to whom he explains his concepts and principles and laws and the way he operates, and then he commissions them to go forward in the mission. He told his disciples, go, preach the gospel. Go, I'm sending you out. Go. He didn't tell the angels. He could have called 12 legions of angels to protect himself. He didn't. But why couldn't he call them to minister and preach the gospel? He couldn't. He entrusted that to you and I. God's got a plan. So God's plan in the case of Moses was, God was preparing a basket. Isn't that cool? To counter the enemy plan and forces by preparing a basket. God prepared a little basket for a little baby. But he did it in the heart of committed, brave people. His parents. And they saw that the child is beautiful. And they decided to protect that child, believing that God's got a plan. God has prepared a basket to counter the plans of hell. And guess what? It worked. It worked. Then another time, when another baby was coming and the enemy knew it, God has prepared a manger for a brave family that has committed in their hearts to protecting this baby who came through some very controversial circumstances and messy opinions of the villagers and people around them. Mary was pregnant, and Joseph and her were already betrothed, but they weren't married yet. They were engaged, and they were to be married, and all of a sudden she's pregnant, and Joseph is doing this, and people are doing that, and there's a whole mess all around. But they were brave enough in their heart. They were obedient enough to the vision of God. They were brave to say, you know what? God's got a plan. And as they were randomly living their life, because the government commanded them to go and take the census, they just lived their life. They walked over to that city, Bethlehem. God's got a plan. God said, in Bethlehem of Judea, the Messiah will be born. We can look at things in our life and say, well, it's just an accident. I'm in this mess. The whole ideology, the whole nation of Egypt is persecuting me. There's devil, hell, and the world. They're coming against me. Can I tell you to relax? God's got a basket for you. Would you buy that? God's got a basket. God's got a manger. God's got a place. God's got a plan. But you know what He wants today? He wants bravery in you and my heart. That in the midst of all that stuff that is happening all around us, we're going to stand up tall. And let Him lead the way.